The Book of Esther is in the Old Testament, just before the Book of Job, and it is concerned with historical things that occurred in the Far East about 500 years before the birth of Christ. And in those days, there had been a number of empires. There'd been the Syrian Empire, there'd been the Babylonian Empire, and now the empire that ruled over a very large amount of that part of the country, from Ethiopia all the way over to the borders of India, ruled by the Persians, or the Medes and the Persians. And they had overcome the previous empires. And they had built an empire that was something like 3,000 miles across, consisting of 127 provinces, most of which would have been independent nations conquered by these successive empires. And so that's the historical background, if you like. But the Book of Esther is well known, I think, for the fact that it doesn't mention God anywhere. And some people say, well, it shouldn't be in the Bible because it doesn't say anything about God. But the truth is that although it doesn't mention God by name, it is absolutely saturated with the sovereignty of God. It demonstrates how God moves in a mysterious way, as the hymn puts it, how God works, if you like, behind the scenes. He sometimes works through his people, sometimes he works independently of his people, but God is in complete control. As the New Testament says in Ephesians 1, verse 11, it says that God orders all things according to the purpose of his will. And that is something that the Book of Esther teaches in a very clear and repeated way. Now, to come to the actual text, there are a number of primary characters that we meet in the Book of Esther. The first is the king of Persia, King Ahasuerus. He is the king of Persia and the emperor of the Persian Empire. The second person we meet is a man called Haman, who the king had promoted to the highest office in the civil service. He was like a prime minister. Like we have prime ministers in the West of the country today. So Haman had so impressed the king that he had been appointed as prime minister. So we've got the king, we've got Haman, and then we have a Jew called Mordecai, who had brought up as if he were his own daughter, a girl called Esther. This is what it's all about. Now, Esther was actually the niece, and Mordecai was the uncle. But the issue is that she was brought up by Mordecai, although she was 20 years younger than he was. And those four characters are the ones we're going to meet in this particular passage. Now, the situation that had arisen, once again, this is background, that Haman hated Jews. And that goes back 800 years to the time when Israel occupied the promised land of Canaan. Joshua led them in, conquered that land. One of the tribes that they conquered were the Amalekites. And the Amalekites were a particularly evil tribe. And they had practiced child sacrifice and all sorts of terrible things. And God told Joshua to annihilate the Amalekite tribe. And he didn't succeed, but he did his best to do that. Now, Haman was a descendant of the Amalekites. And Haman had been brought up from a young person to hate the Jews for what they had done to his forefathers in that occasion in the occupation of Canaan. So Haman had a reason for hating the Jews. Not a rational one, because it happened all 800 years ago, and there was a very different reason for wanting to remove their opponents. But Haman, nevertheless, had made up his mind that he was going to somehow gain sufficient power in the Persian Empire that he was able to order the annihilation of all Jews, children, parents, young, old, any Jew in that enormous empire, 127 provinces, and he had lied to the king by saying that the Jews, he didn't call them Jews, he said, there is a people in your empire who do not obey your laws. They have their own laws. They don't obey the king's laws. And I can read a few verses of that attempt that Haman made to get control and eliminate the Jews. Anti-Semitism is not new. Let's read this. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people, called Jews, a certain people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other people, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. That I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasury. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you. You do with them as seems good to you. Now, the signet ring was important, like a seal, and nothing became law unless it had been stamped, impressed with the king's seal, the king's signet ring. And by giving Haman the signet ring, he basically handed all of his royal powers to Haman and said, well, get on with it, do something about it, get rid of these people, not knowing they were Jews, and not knowing that what Haman said about them was completely untrue. There was no evidence at all that they didn't obey the king's laws. Anyway, that's all background. Now, Haman had achieved this high position in the government of the Persian Empire, and he had written an edict using the king's signet ring. He had impressed that edict, and therefore it had become law, a law of the Medes and the Persians. You ever heard that expression? Well, we often use it today, or perhaps we don't often use it. It is used today to indicate something you can't change. And the law of the Medes and the Persians was that once that signet ring had been impressed upon a written form of the law, then that law could not be changed, not even by the king. It had to be carried out. And so this edict had been published by Haman, and when the Jews, of course, heard about it, they were horrified that an entire race was going to be eliminated. And we have to realize that that empire was so large that the entire living race of Jews would have been living within that empire, because their homeland, Judea and Palestine and so on, and other places where Jews had dispersed, this empire was so big that if you killed all the Jews within the empire, there really would be no Jews left. And that would mean that God's ancient promises to Abraham and so on, that it had been made thousands of years before all this was happening, that they could not be fulfilled, because he had promised that of Jewish parents, a Messiah would be born, would come to save the people. As he's talking about Christ, of course. So if Haman's plan had succeeded, Christ could not have been born of the Jewish people, and the whole of the New Testament would not exist. And perhaps Christianity would not exist. So this is something of enormous importance historically, although it's all happening in a very small place in one city called the city of Shushan, and in the palace of the king. It was all happening in a very confined space, but nevertheless, it had worldwide implications. Now, as soon as the Jews heard that this edict had been published and it couldn't be changed, they were, of course, horrified, but they started to pray. They fasted and prayed. And by apparent accident, the queen of that time, the queen of the emperor, queen of King Ahasuerus, had been a replacement for a previous queen who hadn't obeyed what the king ordered her to do. So she got sacked and then searched for a new queen. And out of the, millions of people in the empire, it turned out that Esther was selected to be queen. I'm writing a book on this, and the second chapter is entitled The Improbable Queen. The probability of a Jew being chosen as queen was vanishing. But God is sovereign, you see. God ordered events and circumstances so that it was Esther who was chosen. So there she was. And Mordecai, her adopted father, if you like, had told her, don't ever tell anyone, don't tell the king, don't tell anyone that you are a Jew. So the king didn't know she was a Jew. Haman didn't know she was a Jew. And then Mordecai said to Esther, look, you have come to the kingdom, that is to say, you have become a queen for such a time as this. You may have heard this expression, for such a time as this. Because only Esther, as queen, had any chance of approaching the king to get him to cancel this pogrom, this murder of the Jews, destruction, annihilation of the Jewish race. She was the only one who had sufficient access to the seat of power to do anything about it. And so Mordecai said, well, Esther, you've got to go and talk to the king about this. You tell him that you've got to stop it. And Esther said, well, that's all very well, but I am not able, it's a funny sort of marriage, I am not able to go to see the king unless he calls me to go. And he said, he hasn't called me for 6 weeks. I can't just walk in, because to walk in uninvited was death. Anyone who walked into the king's throne room without an invitation would be put to death, unless the king held out his golden scepter towards that person. Then that person could come forward, touch the end of the scepter, and go in and talk to the king. Well, these are really strange rules, of course, but we're talking about ancient Middle East situations. So Esther had put her life on line, and she had done that. She had gone, and she had entered the king's throne room, and he had extended to her the scepter. She had touched him, and he had invited her in. She was his wife, but she couldn't go and see him unless he told her to come. But there you are, it wasn't a normal marriage in any way. And he said to her, oh, Queen Esther, what do you want? Why have you come to see me? Tell me your request, and I will give it to you up to half of my kingdom. Didn't mean that, of course. All he meant was I would be very generous. And Esther had gone in, and remember her objective was to ensure that the king understood what was about to happen and understood that she and her people would be destroyed unless he did something about it. But whose side was the king on? You see, the king had given Haman permission to do this, and had put him in a position that he could write his own edict, impress it with the king's seal, guarantee that in 12 months' time, all the Jews would be killed, murdered throughout the empire. The king actually couldn't change that. And you would have thought she would immediately have said to the king, look, you've got to stop this, you've got to stop this, you've got to do something about this. But because the king had given Haman permission to do it, she realized that she couldn't do it because she had no idea whose side the king would take. And so she was very clever. And I think by that, I mean that God put it into her heart and mind to be very clever. And so when he said, I give you half of my kingdom, what do you want? She said, oh, nothing like that. I just want you to come to a feast I'm preparing today and to bring Haman with you. Yeah, that's easy enough, he said. So he ordered Haman to come to the feast, and they went to the feast. And I would call this the first feast, because at that feast, the king repeated his invitation. Queen Esther, what do you want? I'll give it to you, up to half of my kingdom. And what Esther said was, well, I want to repeat this feast. Can we do it again tomorrow? With just you and Haman as the guests. And the king said, well, no problem, we'll do that. So there were two feasts on successive days. And why did Esther do that? Why did God prompt her to do it? Well, the answer was that Esther has really no idea of the relationship between the king and Haman. Okay, they had an official relationship. He was king. Haman was the prime minister. But what did the king really think of Haman? What was the chemistry between them? And at the first feast, she sat back and said nothing, basically. And she listened to the king and Haman talking together. And she realized that the king was actually a bit cross with Haman, because Haman was a very self-centered, boastful man, and he couldn't help boasting about his powers and his wealth and all the things he had done. And she sensed that the king was not actually 100% on Haman's side. And then that same evening, something quite remarkable happened. King couldn't sleep. And after a while, he gave up trying and called for the official records of the empire, called the Chronicles, called for the Book of the Chronicles to be brought in and read to him. The Book of the Chronicles must be about 50 tomes, hundreds of pages. And the scribe who was doing the reading, the king didn't tell him to choose a passage. The king said, read me something. Perhaps he thought it was going to be so boring that it would send him to sleep. I don't know why he called for this to be read. He said, anyway, the scribe basically opened the book at random, and he read from the book the story of how, at least 2 years earlier, or something like that, Mordecai had actually saved the king's life by discovering a plot to kill the king by some of his own servants. And Mordecai reported it. He told Esther. Esther told the king. And the matter was investigated, and the plotters were found guilty and executed. Great. They've all written in the book and then forgotten. As this sleepless king heard the book written and heard this story of how Mordecai the Jew had saved his life, he said, well, what reward have we given to Mordecai? Or what honor have we bestowed upon him in gratitude for this? And the scribe said, nothing been done. And the king said, no, we can't have that. We must reward this man, and I'm going to do it tonight about midnight. This is happening, and he said we must do it now. I can't wait till morning. too upset by the fact that we have neglected to reward this man who saved my life. And so he sent for high-ranking officials working in what's called the second courtyard, because they met and interviewed people who came and wanted to see the king. Didn't have much chance for getting through, but they were interviewed, and the occasional one was given permission to have an appointment with the king. So he knew he had some high-ranking officials there, and one of the factors about King Ahasuerus was that he never liked making decisions himself. He always wanted some help, some support, some confirmation that any decision he made was the right decision. That was a characteristic of the man all the way through the story of Esther. And so he sends someone over to the outer court to get one of these high-ranking officials to come and help him make the decision how to reward Mordecai the Jew. At that very moment, Haman, who couldn't sleep because he wanted so filled with hatred for Mordecai the Jew, who wouldn't bow to him, and he couldn't sleep. His wife and his friends and advisors said, "Oh, get rid of him. Go to the king tomorrow morning and ask him to hang Mordecai, and we'll build the gallows for him to hang on, because he wouldn't bow to Haman. The king had told people they should bow to him." So he was all prepared to see Mordecai hanged the following morning, and so he couldn't sleep either. And so he went over to the inner court just at the time that the king asked for someone from the outer court to come and help him decide on a reward for Mordecai. And had he come a minute later, one of the high-ranking officials would have already gone to the king. But he said, who is in the court? He asked the question, who is there? And they sent a message back saying, well, Haman's here. He's just turned up. And the king said, "Stand and amen." Now, that was crazy, wasn't it? The king knew that Haman hated Mordecai. And so the last person to advise the king on how to reward Mordecai the Jew would be Haman. But you see, I think the king had got to the point where he wanted to test Haman's loyalty to him. He was beginning to doubt. So he said, that's an opportunity. I'll put it to the test. Send Haman. So Haman came into the king, and the king, without mentioning the name of Mordecai, of course, because that would have spoiled the whole thing, he said, what reward is due to the man that the king delights to honor? The image of Mordecai. Now, Haman, because he was such a self-centered person, thought, well, the only person the king would want to honor is me. So he said, this is how it should be done. Let the person to be honored be clothed in royal robes and put on the king's horse, and then let one of the high-ranking princes lead that man, the horse, sorry, lead the horse, not some stable boy or a vessel, but he was the highest-ranking person that the king could find to lead the horse with the person to be rewarded sitting on it. And of course, the person who leads the horse is below the person who sits on the horse. And so this was a great idea, because he thought that was going to happen to him. And then he was horrified when the king said, that's a good idea. You go and clothe Mordecai in high robes and sit him on my horse, and you personally lead him through the streets of Shushan, proclaiming, this is the man that the king delights to honor. So Haman was absolutely mortified, but he couldn't do anything else. He had to do what the king told him to do. And so he had gone through these motions, and when this tour of the city was over, he went home. And that's where we come in our reading. He went home, and we are told that he was home with a covering on his head. Covering was, in those days, a sign of mourning. When people went to funerals, they would cover their heads as a sense of grief and mourning. And so we're told that Haman went back. This is chapter 6, verse 12. Afterwards, after this tour of the city, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And when Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." Now, I'm sure that Haman, feeling so bruised about this insult to his dignity that had happened in the horse and proclamation thing that morning, he went home looking for comfort and sympathy. He didn't get it, did he? His wife had advisors and his friends said, "Look, if this man Mordecai you're talking about is a Jew, then you're going to fall before him." And that was really what was special about a Jew. Well, there's only one thing that made Jews different from other people, and that was that they believed in a sovereign God. They believed in a God who was active in the affairs of men. And so this pagan woman, the wife of Haman, acknowledged the fact that the Jews had a God who you could never beat, basically. And that's interesting, isn't it? A pagan woman testifying to the power and sovereignty of a God that she knew nothing about. Anyway, the conversation was cut short, but I think we can pick up a lesson, can't we, from that? A positive lesson from a negative way, a negative receipt that Haman experienced among his family. Because the Bible teaches us a completely opposite thing, that we should support members of our human family. And our attitude towards members of our human family, if they're getting into any trouble, would be sympathetic. It would be helpful. It would be comforting. It would console them. And that's what we should do. And, that is a uniform teaching of the Bible. So many references that you should be helpful, kindly, sympathetic to members of your earthly family. And I'm going to give you just one verse that sums all that up. It's in the New Testament, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8. The Apostle Paul writes, "If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." It sums up a whole body of teaching about our attitude to the members of our family, which we should be kindly towards them, sympathetic. We should help them, especially if there is any kind of trouble. We should gather round them and uphold them, encourage them, which is the opposite of the way Haman was received by his own family. Anyway, that conversation was cut short because remember that Esther had asked the king for to attend another feast. And that was happening. The day before, he and Haman had attended the first feast, and now the day after comes the second feast. And they sit down, and Haman must have felt a little bit encouraged by this, because he said, "Well, my family are very negative about me, but my invitation to have lunch with Queen Esther has not been cancelled. And so it must mean that I'm still in some degree of favour with the Queen." And so he would have gone along to the second feast, and he would have been perhaps hopeful that he would be able to escape from the humiliation, and restored after the humiliation he had suffered.